Top focus on Donald Trump. Former US President Donald Trump is expected to address a public rally in New Hampshire. Now, what's interesting about this public rally is the fact that in New Hampshire, there are going to be dueling events, one that of Donald Trump and the other of Ron DeSantis. Interestingly, Florida's Republican Governor Ron DeSantis is going to be addressing a public meeting in New Hampshire too. Now, remember, this other event has also been slammed considering Ron DeSantis was not expected to hold a dueling event at the time Donald Trump was expected to address this luncheon taking place in New Hampshire. Since launching his campaign last month, DeSantis has largely sought to project himself as a more conservative than the former president in an attempt to dethrone him as the party's dominant figure. Now, the dueling campaigns come at a time when Donald Trump's audio clip is also grabbing eyeballs and headlines today. Remember, this audio clip has been released exclusively by CNN. The former president is being heard in this audio clip as sharing classified information about Pentagon's plans to attack Iran. Now, the recorded conversation is from the year 2021, during which former President Donald Trump acknowledged about a potential attack on the Islamic Republic. What will be the impact of this audio clipping? More importantly, where does Donald Trump stand in New Hampshire? Let's try and get in a sense of perspective. And for that, let me introduce my guests. I'm joined in by Corinne Clark, who's a Republican strategist, also joined in by Nicole Brenner-Schmitz, who's a Democrat strategist. Many thanks to you, Corinne and Nicole. Corinne, if I could take my first question from you. This feud, as far as Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis are concerned, this feud is now boiling over in New Hampshire. How do you view DeSantis' timing of his own campaign event, which has been condemned by a certain section of Republican supporters?
Yeah, Donald Trump will be attending a large luncheon with Republican women, which is obviously a very important voting bloc, and one that the DeSantis campaign has claimed he has quite the grip on, that Donald Trump would never get. But Donald Trump is addressing that crowd of Republican women to raise money for Republican women candidates. And Ron DeSantis is hosting a competing event about 40 miles away with a much smaller crowd. A lot of the women hosting this fundraiser that Trump is speaking at have felt insulted by that competing event because it takes away from their fundraising opportunity. So I don't think it was very well thought out from the DeSantis campaign.
All right. Nicole, how do you view Ron DeSantis in the entire picture? The one big question that not just Democrats but Republicans too within their own quarters are asking is, can Ron DeSantis break Donald Trump's hold on New Hampshire?
Well, the interesting thing is that normally in primaries on both sides of the aisle, these candidates are in Iowa and New Hampshire so much if there's an open seat on their side. That they naturally end up with overlapping events. I think the rub here is that it seems that the governor has gone out of his way to purposely schedule one in direct conflict, and that seems to be angering some of these Republican women who are hosting the one for Trump, which just doesn't seem like a great strategy on the governor's behalf, having this group of women become upset about his timing. But this is a state that's used to being inundated by campaign events, so it's sort of an odd frustration in my mind, but not really that smart on the governor's behalf to anger a whole bunch of the base in that state that he, presumably is courting and trying to have support him both financially and in votes.
Right. Corinne, it's interesting that Nicole has called this a deliberate strategy, which is something to say the least. Trump remains popular among Republicans, and even more so after his indictments. Does this not speak of DeSantis' biggest challenge, and which is of Donald Trump's popularity that remains?
Absolutely, especially in New Hampshire. New Hampshire voted for Trump in 2016 in the primary, and just a couple months ago on CNN, New Hampshire hosted a very enthusiastic crowd for Donald Trump at the CNN town hall. If you saw that town hall, you listened to that audience, you could tell there are a lot of Trump supporters in that crowd. DeSantis has to overcome that. He has Trump's popularity, but also candidates like Chris Christie and Tim Scott, who have been trying to make some headway in New Hampshire as well. So he has a much bigger hill to climb than Donald Trump. Donald Trump just has to keep the people who already like him happy. But DeSantis has to find all of these new voters, and then he has a bunch of competition for those non-Trump voters as well.
All right. Nicole, could New Hampshire be trickier compared to an Iowa or South Carolina? You just mentioned Iowa, but because New Hampshire is also reported to have a history of being more libertarian, do you think that that could also be why both have chosen New Hampshire as one of those writing places for which, there, in fact, a lot depends on New Hampshire, and why so?
I mean, look, they've picked New Hampshire because that's the American setup for our elections right now. I mean, the way that the primary system will work in the Republican Party, Iowa will have the first caucus for them. New Hampshire will have the first primary. It gives you a lot of momentum. There's always been a great deal of energy coming out of those states if you are the top dog. They just matter in our politics and the way we set up our caucus and primary system. So you're going to see every candidate, I think, spend a lot of time there. The interesting that you noted that New Hampshire does have more of a libertarian streak, and we're seeing candidates run in all different ways at the former president. To your point earlier, Governor DeSantis is claiming to be the true conservative, more conservative. That's sort of a lane that Tim Scott is going in as well, while you have a Chris Christie of the world who's clearly making it more about the personality and the name calling and the sort of behavior of the former president and what needs to happen in his eyes in the White House and what kind of decorum. So you're seeing candidates take all sorts of different angles as to why they should be the nominee, but it's a lot of competition for those voters who are not going to support the former president, because I think, as the co-panelists accurately said, Trump really just needs to sort of keep who he's got. He's not necessarily courting new voters in the party. He's just trying within the base on the Republican side to keep what he's got. But everybody needs to approach this with an eye to the general and think about where the independents in this country are and what's going to set them up best. But you can't compete for those independents until you get the nomination out of your party.
Corey, you heard what Nicole has to say. Would you weigh in on that aspect? But having said that, how much rests upon New Hampshire as a battleground state for someone like a Ron DeSantis to come up with a dueling event despite much condemnation coming his way?
It would be a great victory for Ron DeSantis to have an early victory. As Nicole said, it's the first primary is New Hampshire. So what that does is sets in the domino effect when you're going across the country with all of the primaries and caucuses. If you can say, we have a victory in Iowa, we have a victory in New Hampshire, people start feeling pressure to vote for the guy who's already in the lead. So obviously the most amount of these primaries you can stack under your belt benefits a candidate. And for someone like Ron DeSantis, who's coming against a powerhouse like Trump, it matters a little bit more to have that notoriety behind you. I do think he has a much more difficult battle in New Hampshire. He probably has a better chance in Iowa. Iowa tends to lean more of establishment, where Ron seems to be picking up a lot of support within the Republican Party. I know that I've already seen a lot of DeSantis surrogates talk about how much the New Hampshire primary doesn't matter. So I think that they've settled for not winning this one, and that is probably because they can't.
All right, Nicole, let's now finally discuss the audio clip that has been accessed by CNN exclusively. Donald Trump's reference to something he says is highly confidential and his apparent showing of those documents to other people at the meeting. Does it not undercut his claims that he made later at Fox News and in an interview that he did not have any documents with him? How does that place his own claims?
I mean, it certainly does, but Donald Trump has never allowed his words to get in the way of his next story. This is the continuation of what we've seen through his candidacies and his presidencies. And unfortunately, we do see a base that seems to stick with him really no matter what revelations come about. There's an excuse, there's a reason, it's a witch hunt. So I don't think we're going to see a big erosion in his base within the party, but this is what presents a challenge for him in a general going up against President Biden, because this is much of what Biden talked about when he ran against him in 2020 was corruption and possibilities of this. And now there's just going to be more and more and more on top of that. So you can be sure that the administration is going to be running on this. But for right now, they're letting the Republicans beat him up about it, the folks in his own primary, and they're sort of letting them take the lead. And I think you'll see a step up on that rhetoric if and when he is the nominee for the general.
All right, Corinne, let's also bring you in on this aspect. In a year which is so crucial for Donald Trump, not just legally, we know the host of legal wars he's already battling, but also in a pivotal year for the United States and his own presidency plans, what could such a revelation mean?
Yeah, well, I think that the fact that this audio was leaked to CNN actually supports a lot of Trump supporters and 70% of this country who believes this was a politically motivated case, because it's not usual that the Department of Justice leaks audio for an ongoing investigation to what is well known in America as a liberal network. So I think that will only support people who believe this is a witch hunt, as Nicole stated, a lot of us do. And stuff like this just proves it. There is a collusion between the Department of Justice and the media to try to sway public opinion, because at the end of the day, this is not about criminal charges. It is about ruining Trump's campaign. I don't think we're going to see a lot of criticism from anyone who hopes to win the Republican primary. I'm sure you'll see people who have settled on being last place, like Will Hurd, come out, someone who supports the establishment elite, someone who is part of the deep state. They will say this is going to hurt Trump, but anyone who wants to win a Republican primary will only stand behind the fact that this is a weaponized case, unprecedented, against a former president. And this leaking to the mainstream media just proves that.
All right, I think that's been summed up in a more or less balanced manner by you, Corinne, and Nicole as well. I'm going to wrap up this discussion on that note. Thank you so much, Corinne and Nicole, for joining in with your precious inputs. It's always a pleasure to have you on our show.